And we are now on air. Welcome, all you good folks, to tonight's event here at the Art Path. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on in the wide world. And this is one of the positive ways of contradicting what's going on in the wide world, because it's just heavy, kind of yucky stuff, you know? So we come here and we lift our spirits through the doorways and the pathways and the entryways of art. We are with our very beloved host, Thompsom Williams and Company. Thompson, it's your show.
All righty.
Oh, I forgot. Right. I forgot the most important thing. Right? This is supported by Herbal Gardens Wellness, a nonprofit organization. You can go to their storefront and buy all sorts of little goodies, or you can make an in-kind donation specifically directed towards the Art Path, where this can be continued to air on a public access. And this is also brought to you by White Stallion Studios. It's your show, Thompson. Have fun.
Okay, let's try it again. All right, we'd like to welcome tonight Christo Apache, a poet, writer, educator, advocate from Denver, Colorado. And I'd like you to introduce yourself there, Chris.
Okay, well, thank you, Thompson, and everyone for having me here. I'll be glad to talk a little bit about poetry, about my writing, what influences me and all that stuff. Just to start though, the month of April is Poetry Month. So one of the things that I love to do through social media is post some of the poems that inspire me. So if you go to my Facebook page or my Twitter page or my Instagram page, you'll find that there are going to be some postings about poetry that from some of my favorite poets and from poets that I know. So that's my goal for this month, is to post one poem a day. My name is Crisosto Apache, and I'm from the Muscular Apache Reservation in New Mexico. I currently live here in Lakewood, Colorado, which is a suburb of Denver. I'm Muscalero Apache, I'm Cherokee Apache, and I'm also Dene. On my father's side, my clans are Ashii Dene, which is Salt Clan, and Kia'ani Dene, which is Towering House Clan. And this is how I am human. I work at the College of the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design as an associate professor of English. And I'm also the associate poetry editor for the Offing magazine. I have one book out published by Lost Alphabet called Genesis Redacted. And I don't know if you can see the book. It's probably backwards. This book came out in 2018. It was part of my thesis, and I'm really proud of the work that comes out of it. I do have a second book coming out mid-year from Gnashing Teeth Publishing, and that book is called Ghost Word. And I'll talk a little bit about that later when I read some of the work from it. I may read some work from Genesis Redacted as well. So that's a little bit about me. And I'd be happy to just kind of jump into some conversation about poetry and writing. Maybe I'll start out with a reading, not sure.
Whichever you feel comfortable with, because we can kind of get an idea of what your poetry is like.
Okay, so maybe I'll just kind of go in between and weave everything together.
Okay.
We'll read some poems, we'll talk about writing, we'll read some more poems, and then talk some more about writing.
All righty.
And don't forget, we can also access the share screen so that it kind of be like a view for all.
Okay. I see. So some of the poems I'm going to read, a lot of it has been published. The first poem I'm going to start off with is from my current manuscript that I'm still working on, that I'm hoping to push out to publishers by the end of the year. And the manuscript is called Isness, Isness. The poem that I'm going to start off with tonight is it's called A Prayer for Us, and it was published out of the University of Melbourne, Australia. They put out an anthology this past year, and I was really glad that they took this particular poem and gave it a house or a home to live in printed work. So this is the first poem from that manuscript. And it's called A Prayer for Us. Our song is sung to the eastern mountain. Our refrain remains inside a newborn. In spring, chirping flickers push the quiet song, and we belong among the morning air. Our song is sung toward the southern mountain. Our youth in playful poise levels the afternoon and heightens the yellow grasses. Our children build the frames of arbors holding the trees together. Our song is sung to the western mountain. Our drum beat demands consent of elders to reflect the knowledge and hold better ways of life that carve the strength in our voices. Our song is sung in the northern mountain. Our cries echo through looming slow fog and waiting valleys as ash is spread on frozen grounds to muffle the somber sighs and heavy sounds. This particular poem, when I wrote it, I was really, and it was sort of at the beginning of the pandemic, because I was spending a lot of time indoors, and I wasn't really sure how to feel about that. It was during the time where a lot of the mandates were happening, and I spent a lot of time, just in isolation, basically, teaching online. I wasn't leaving the house very much. My office was in a very small room in our house, and I've been just doing a lot of reading. And I woke up one early morning, and I was just kind of thinking about what the pandemic has really done to me as an individual. And I really started to think what others might have felt in terms of like being in this isolation. So that's really where this poem came out of, is, waking up one morning and really just thinking about the place, where I was at in terms of how I was experiencing this pandemic. And it's been probably like a year and a half now later. And, I'm not sure how to feel about that. I'm just slowly getting out into the world again, getting out of my house. And even going into public spaces, I think is still uncomfortable for me somewhat. But I think just this idea of just making sure that we remember like where we come from and how we relate to one another. Because I think things in this world are just becoming apparent because of what we're seeing in social media and what we're seeing in the news and what's just happening around the world. The poem that I posted on social media today is called "A Second Coming" by W.B. Yeats. And that's one poem that really speaks to me, because he wrote this poem during World War II. And a lot of it is about that idea of turmoil and how people sort of deal with themselves during these moments of turmoil. And I've certainly been thinking about that lately, especially what's going on in the Ukraine. So that's the poem I wanted to start off with. And again, that's from my third manuscript called Isness. Which way to go?
Exactly what is the title of that third manuscript? What does that actually mean?
A lot of the poems that are in that third manuscript is really just about poems of just being without question. Mm-hmm. That they sort of just represent what is happening and what those moments are about, without really like trying to justify a meaning through them. And so, and I think this idea of isness for me is just, it's just really focusing on something without really thinking about it too much. Really just giving meaning for what something means as opposed to, trying to fit a meaning into it. I mean, I can read another poem from that, just to kind of give an example. And most of these poems that come from that manuscript are just about really small moments of witness, or like just like being in the now, or just being in the moment where you're sort of just experiencing what's going on around you. This second poem that I'm reading from that same manuscript is called Calm. And it really is about a moment where I attended a conference in Estes Park. There was a social movement conference that was happening up there. And one of the rooms where I stayed in had this balcony that was facing one of the peaks in Estes Park. And it was a beautiful campus. A lot of the people that I've worked with in the past, that I've built some relationship with, were there. So it was really nice to have these conversations. So this poem is called Calm, and it's inspired by this moment of me standing on this balcony looking out. Calm. An unlocked door is open and hints at a greeting of moist whispers made from the mild autumn air. Dusk doles out a crisp caress of soft viscous breeze that engages the infinite motion of nurturing sky. I am calm with a tiny tremble. Clean wisps of slow whirls work their way over the cascading juts of ancient snow-capped constructs. A small gust engulfs the mountainous space like burlap decay as raindrops linger, abiding temptation from the sky. I am calm with a tiny tremble. Minuscule water droplets descend in a thrust of trembling cold masses as the mist undulates in the ever-changing. Molecules gyrate like dissolving melons inside my mouth as the autumn trees flicker in the embers of the burning twilight. I am calm with a tiny tremble. A bluish plight of an abundant heaven complicates the scenic sights and captures the lust of golden serrations in my hands. Outstretched boughs of aspen gleams the sky of yesterday, and reminiscent reflections of stars becomes a theater in the window. I am calm with a tiny tremble. The encapsulating height of my mountain surroundings reminds me I am on a balcony at dusk in Estes Park, Colorado. So for me, the idea behind this third manuscript, again, it's really just kind of being in the moment and also just taking notice about what's around you. And I think that for me really influences my writing a lot because I'm trying to be kind of immersed with what's happening around me. I really do like to pay attention to what's going on around me because there's a lot of motion. I think sometimes we sort of just walk through life and not really notice like what's happening. We're sort of paying attention to a lot of distractions around us, and we sometimes stop to just think, pay attention to nature. Sometimes nature really wants to be paid attention to. There's so much beauty and natural things happening with nature. So I think this poem is kind of about that. It's really just taking a moment and just looking around you and seeing how nature impacts you as a person, and seeing what you notice with what's happening there. So this other poem is about watching spiders being born, because there was this spider, I guess it's a sac or a spider cocoon that a spider had placed near the light, porch light. So it was there and she was taking care of it throughout some time. And I just happened to go out one night, and all of a sudden they started coming out. And it was just interesting just to sort of watch them, do their thing as they kind of emerged from this pouch, this woven pouch. And they kind of hung around there. Then they would climb to the top of the lamp, the house lamp outside, and then they would jump or just kind of fly with the breeze. And they had these long strands of web that would just carry them into the darkness, which I thought was really kind of interesting just to watch. And again, it's just one of these moments where if you just stop for a minute and take notice the things that you can see, that you pay attention to. And it's just life. It's life just happening and life just being. And I'm not really sure how often we allow ourselves to sort of engage in those moments, because I think that those types of moments feed who I am as a creative person and as a person, just trying to move through the world. This poem was published in a literary website based here in Colorado. And I did a couple of readings for them, but the organization is called 20 Bellows. So this poem is called Born for Thorax. Tonight, beneath a cluster of stars, they are born, emerging from their tightly woven pouch. Under a dim light of 1,000 wicker specks, they march up to the highest point and jump off single file, a microscopic battalion of 8-legged paratroopers descending gallantly, disseminating from a red chili pod palace. They dangle and sway. Away from their thin strands of a woven curtain, they scaffold up to the rooftop, attached to an impressing umbilical cord, unaware of their shimmer in the moonlit peril. When the last cord is pulled, they scamper into valleys and crevasses, like tiny silhouettes scattering a broken hack of black beads. Emerging from their exquisite cocoon, they continue to dance and dangle on a trapeze flight, flittering, without doubt, until early morning, when the dews consume the skeletal structure and wean. So yeah, I'm pretty captivated to just kind of paying attention to these moments, and I think they're really beautiful, and I really like just being able to watch and experience these moments, and when I'm enthralled like that, I immediately come inside and I start writing about it. So I think I find myself just being inspired by a lot of various different events happening in life. And I think for me, this is really good because, especially like I said, experiencing the last year and a half during this pandemic, there's only so much you can notice in your house before you go stir crazy. So I would go outside in the yard and just kind of look around, because there's a lot of different things in our yard that, you see life happening. But so that's one of the inspirations that I get when I'm writing, just being able to pay attention to my surroundings. I'm going to read probably a couple more from this particular manuscript. Like I said, it's still in the works. My plan is to maybe try to start soliciting the work from this manuscript toward the end of the year. So I have a 2-month break coming up here in about a month or so, and my goal is to focus on this and try to finish it. But here's another poem that is kind of noticing the moon. My neighbor has some white flowers that bloom at night, and I guess they're called moon orchids. And this is kind of inspired by that. And they're really bright and they're white, so you can still see them in the dark. And I noticed them one night when I was outside, and the moon was full, so they were really bright that night. But this poem is called Orchid Moon. In the lull of an evening veil, your face appears as apparition Your hand lifts to a tide of moon orchids. High in a mountain canyon, I slept underneath an aspen grove, with intent to ease the release of a reluctant memory. Breezes may exhume my mind, but not like the impressionable confidence in your caress. Doubt still lingers upon my skin, along with the insurmountable death you carry inside your blood. One day when I wake from my disregarding slumber, I will notice your stance in that silhouette garb. The sound of crushing gravel beneath my feet disturbs the soft radiating orchid petals that cringe beneath the moonlight. I am reminded of lunar displays inside folds of opaque petals. Blink one eye and the moon is there. Blink the other and it disappears completely. Slide of fingers on both eyelids views the moon in all its brightness. In this perpetual gaze upon this moon, her light shines upon these forbidding eyes. I then become her. So I suppose our relationship with our environments is really huge. And I think a lot of it, like I said, influences my work. And I think with maybe with every poet that I know feels this way, I suppose. I didn't start my career out as a writer or as a poet. I started my career out as a painter or an illustrator. That's what got me into college. I'd won a couple of art contests when I was in high school. So it gave me an opportunity to go to college with a paid tuition. So I took advantage of that and moved away from home and began to experience life off the reservation. So my art got me into college, and I was really excited to be at college and to be away from home and to sort of experience something new. But what I didn't know is that going out on your own, you have these experiences that sometimes are really awful. And you kind of just have to learn how to be in places that are far away from home, where you have the support that you naturally have when you're with your family. But for me, going off to college and starting college off when I did, and I was young, I was naive, and what did I know about living in the world? You know, and I was pretty confident with who I was then, because my family was very supportive of me, one, being in the arts, being creative, and then also just supporting me with who I was as a person. And I'm deeply grateful for that to this day. But while I was in college, this was in Santa Fe, New Mexico, I attended the Institute of American Indian Arts to start. I enrolled in their associate program. And I really loved going to that school because it was, one, nice to be surrounded by a lot of Native Americans. And so I made a lot of friends there that were Native Americans that I still talk to this day. And I'm very grateful for a lot of those friendships. And really experienced a lot during that time. But one of the things that happened to me while I was going to school there is a memory that kind of sticks with me. And I've kind of wanted to sort of put it in the back burner, but not. But it still is one of those memories that kind of is in the forefront. And I've never forgotten it. But we were always very excited when a new club opened up in town, because there wasn't very many of them. So there was this one club that we used to go to, and it was called the Cargo Club. And I think this was back in like 91 or 92. We were living in Santa Fe. So a bunch of us had gotten together and just decided to walk down to the club. I think we started from campus about 9 o'clock, and we just ended up walking. But as we got closer, we came up to this to one of the convenience stores right before that club, and some of my friends at the time smoked, so they went inside for cigarettes, and some of us stood outside waiting for them. But as we were waiting, I guess we were accosted by a couple of males that pulled up in a pickup truck. It's kind of a memory that still kind of sticks with me. And I guess I would view it today as a hate crime. So this poem is about that. And I've written a couple of stories. One is from sort of a fictional perspective from the other side, and one is about the actual account that happened. And those were published in an anthology here in Colorado. And I'm still working on them. Hopefully they turn into a part of a memoir that I'm sort of working on, a work in progress. But this poem, again, like I said, it's a memory that keeps coming back to me, and I'm not sure how to deal with it other than writing about it. And this certainly isn't the only poem that I've written about this particular instance. But it was a very violent experience for me. And during the moment of that happening, a gun was pulled out, and that was the first time I'd ever felt that. And I felt really helpless. And I realized one of my friends was sort of in the darkness, being accosted by the other person that came out of that truck. And I just really felt helpless that I couldn't help. But this poem is about that incident. And it's called Tonight. Tonight, fists come pounding down. The night sky reveals a humble eye around the corner. They kick and strike his body there. The jolt, the clinch, that gasp of air leaves us weak while he makes a dire sound. From gun, spark, that expels around and misses his head behind the store in town. A release of blood and grunting flare, fists compounding down. They repeat their frantic actions and pound his skull, who lies inert in the wet ground. With a look of hatred they both bear, each fist and beat the face with despair, and define a kind of a natural sound. Tonight, fists compounding down. So, yeah, that poem I know is kind of a heavy-weighted theme, but sometimes poetry has to go there. To sort of awaken, a cause, or to stir the audience, to get them thinking about something that, they may not have an opportunity, not to say that, that was an opportunity to experience, but it definitely gives you something to think about. And I think a lot of my poetry does that.
That was powerful.
Well, thank you. And I think that's one thing that I appreciate about poetry, is that it does allow you to sort of, go and think about these moments that are very painful, and gives you an opportunity to sort of deal with it in some way. And then once you see the words written down and you see them and you can read them and interact with them, it definitely creates a different moment, and gets you to really think about, the things that have been experienced. And again, it's not really one of the most funnest part of my life, but I mean, it's still an experience that, happened. And I know that that there are a lot of people that have experienced that kind of interaction from various people, and many times have lost their lives because of it. Just being who they are, and just being human. And sometimes other people cannot accept who they are. And while I was going to college, a lot of my friends, are gay, and I happen to be gay as well. But and that's who we are. Well, that's who we were then, and we sort of made a community. And there was a whole bunch of us who used to hang around and go do things. So we'll go to art galleries. We'll go to see films, because Santa Fe has a lot of noir film theaters there where foreign films are shown. So there's a lot of different opportunities to do that. But this is one of the experiences that I think still sticks with me. But I was probably like about 20 when this happened. So like I said, I was really naive, and I didn't know what happened, in terms of like living out the reservation, living in what I call then a cosmopolitan town. even though I visited a lot of larger cities, this is like one of the first cities that I've lived in that was, cosmopolitan. But so yes, that's what inspired that poem. And then there's another poem that I wrote about that called Bruise, which kind of goes hand in hand. But yes, like I said, that's one moment that still kind of sticks with me. And when I was a lot younger, I guess it did create some trauma around this idea of trust, while trusting people. So, but I know that there was some questions that were sent to me to kind of think about. And maybe I'll talk a little bit about some of those talking points. But the idea of poetry and how it addresses current issues. I really had to sort of think about what I wanted to do because there's a moment in my life, like 2007, 2008, where I wanted to finish what I started, and that was my education. So I started figuring out and trying to make a plan of what to do. And that's where I went back to school full time because I got laid off from my job during that moment when there was a lot of things happening in terms of laying people off, jobs were getting harder for people to keep and stuff like that. So I decided to take advantage of that situation and go back to school full time, which I enrolled into the Metropolitan University of Denver and finished my bachelor's, my undergraduate program there. My study there was English writing, and I had a minor in Native American studies. I then realized when I started college that, what was I going to do with my writing? So I got the idea that while I was studying writing, and because I had a minor in Native American studies, I started to write whatever subject that I was taking about, whatever subject I was taking in those classes. I started writing about things that pertain to those classes. I mean, I took a Native American politics class, so I went out and did some research about Native American politics. If I was taking a literature class, I would always take the perspective of Native American literature. So whatever class I took, because I was doing a Native American studies program, I tried to make everything I learned about Native Americans. So that was a really good part of what I learned in college, is how to apply some of the writing that I did during that time. So a lot of it dealt with, identity, and mostly indigenous identity. I started learning a lot about history. I started learning a lot about politicals and a lot of things about legal perspective. So it really opened my mind in terms of what writing can do. But as I graduated from that program, I then went off to graduate school. And during graduate school, that really pushed my knowledge in terms of what I wanted to pursue. And so I did my study in Native American poetics. And I, again, went back to the Institute of American Indian Arts because they were just developing a new Masters of Fine Arts program. But while I was my undergrad, I did a lot of focus on historical writing, a lot of indigenous writing. A lot of it dealt with political stuff, like I said. But I started thinking about this idea of how my writing can incorporate more of my identity as a two-spirit person, as a person who is working through this idea of decolonization. Because I see like these constructs that really make us who we are, and sometimes it allows us to be limited in terms of the scope of how we express ourselves. So a lot of it is I'm trying to unlearn this idea of gender, what that means, because we're sort of put into these categories. And I don't want to do that because these constructs are seen as sort of a kind of legal fiction or a kind of fictional kind of idea. So that's, just something I'm thinking off on the side. But a lot of my writing deals with memory, because memory, I think, is something that is inherent in a lot of literature that we look at. Everything that we write is from some historical point. And in my first book, Genesis Redacted, I started to sort of do some research around historical moments that weren't really talked about in Native American history. One of the poems in my book that I wrote was about the mass hanging in Mankato, Minnesota, because that did not really get a lot of discussion in history books. And I started looking at ideas like that to just start writing about, because I thought it was kind of tragic when you look at that incident, and it is considered the largest mass hanging in the United States, and it was ordered executively by Abraham Lincoln. And it was really sad how this whole idea or this whole situation happened, because it happened of a relocation of Lakota people, and it was during the winter of 1862. And if we know anything about the Midwest, especially the northern part of the Midwest, in the wintertime, it gets really cold and that there's a lot of wind that happens there. So I just kind of thought about that moment and thought about how that must have taken place. Because if I'm going to think about something historically, that's really what I want to do with my writing, is sort of take myself and sort of put myself in that place and kind of begin to imagine what these natives were thinking about as they were led to the gallows. This poem that I wrote is called 38 necks plus 2. And in my language, I made the title so that it reflects, my language from where I'm from. And it's pronounced Kus Tadini Sabi, which Kus is the neck. Tadini is the number for 38. Tadini Sabi is 38, and I just put it together with necks because it's really how many people were hung that day, plus 2 that were non-native. And I dedicated this to the writers who travel every year to Mankato, because I remember seeing a documentary about that, which was really captivating for me to sort of watch. Because prior to finding out about this mass hanging, I didn't know anything about it. And then a friend of mine was talking to me about that and said that I should look into it a little bit more and see how it can inspire me. And then I saw the documentary called the Dakota 38, I think is what it was called. But after seeing that, it really made me think more about these historical moments in America that most people don't talk about or don't even make it to the historical textbooks that were sort of made to read if you go to college or if you read in public schools, the history of American indigenous culture. But I started the poem out with an excerpt from a soldier who was was made to stand there as guard, and I just labeled that soldier X. The quote just starts off: "They shook hands with officers who came in among them, bidding them goodbye as if they were going on a long, pleasant journey." As one soldier had talked about as they were going to their execution. But this soldier was on execution detail. And again, like I said, this happened in the wintertime. And I can just imagine, I just can't even imagine what that must have been as far as an experience. But what I did, I consider this a list poem. And a list poem is where you go in and you list things very specifically and talk about them. And in this particular poem, I listed every single one of the names that were part of that mass hanging. So there are 38 names plus the 2 that were a part of that hanging that were non-native. So I did have to do some research in terms of the names that were associated with that hanging, and ended up talking with some Lakota people about the literal translation of what these names were. And I've read this poem a few times publicly, but there was one moment when I was over at the University of Denver. I was invited to the 150th commemoration of the Sand Creek Massacre. And while I was there during this panel, we were able to like read these poems or read our work. And this is one of the poems I read. And there happened to be a lady there that was Lakota, and she spoke the language. So I asked her if she would read this poem with me, and that if she would be able to read the Lakota names in Lakota, which was, I think, very powerful, because just hearing those names read out loud, it's almost what we do when we memorialize people during a tragedy. So for me, it's one of the more powerful poems that I've written, I think, because for one, it's dealing with a specific part of Native American history, for one, that doesn't really get talked about. But I feel really bad talking about this poem because I think it's a long poem, so I'm probably not going to read it because it's a very lengthy poem. But if you do pick up my book, you can read it. I'm not really sure if one of the things I do try to do is I try to record myself reading my poems, and I don't remember if I've done one for this poem or not. But and I know that I have a recording of me and this individual reading this poem, and it might only be in part. And I should probably throw that up on my YouTube channel, just so that people can have an opportunity to see and to hear this particular poem. But it's called 38 Necks, and I dedicated it to the horse riders that ride to Mankato every year. So I'm kind of going off the dial here about stuff. But yeah, that's in terms of impacting current issues. That's what I really try to do with my writing. I try to pay special attention to how my writing can be influenced by our own Indigenous experiences, because our experiences are vast. There are some experiences that are witnessed and some that are unspoken of. So I really try to pay attention to that, and try to use that as inspiration, and also to use this opportunity, because I have a poetic voice, to be able to tell their stories, because I think that it's one of my responsibilities as being a writer, being a poet, that I should at least pay attention to some part of our Indigenous history, to talk about some of these platforms that allow us to look at incidences like this in our experience. So that's one of the things I do pay attention to, that really brings to light current issues. But my writing, I've got a lot of these various different projects that I'm working on. But I try to work on them one at a time, because if I work on them all at the same time, it gets really confusing. But yeah, there's a lot of writers that really influence me, and they are Indigenous writers and there are non-Indigenous writers. But I have bookshelves full of books that are continually inspirational to my writing process. For some of the Indigenous writers that I'm always looking back to, and some of these are my friends that I really work with and have known for some time. But my friend James Thomas Stevens, he's Mohawk, and he's written I think a dozen or so books of poems, And I always refer back to them because many of his poems talk about the land. They talk about relationships and uses the land as metaphor, which I think is really kind of interesting. And I really do love his work. Simon J. Ortiz is another one that I follow. He's Acoma. One of the books that I happened to pick up of his that really made an impact on my life and in terms of writing is his book of poetry called From Sand Creek, which is a really amazing collection of poems if you've not read that book. I didn't know anything about Sand Creek until I moved to Colorado and realized that there was an incident that happened here that involved Native Americans, more specifically of the Arapaho and Cheyennes. One weekend, I decided to drive out to Sand Creek. I didn't realize it was so far out in the plains of eastern Colorado. But it was a very long drive, and when I finally got there, I did just take some time to sort of, listen, because I think that that it was such a place where, a lot of people had perished, but then it also is a memory that, again, like Mankato, many people didn't know about historically, and that how influential that was for many Native Americans. Every year in November, there are runners that run from there here to Denver. But yeah, so From Sand Creek was another one of those inspirational books that I still refer to that sits on my bookshelf. And when I read that, I then was very curious about who Simon J. Ortiz was. And only because he also is from New Mexico, and he has a really huge tie to his Pueblo. So I think that was very, very important for me to know that there were Native Americans that were out there who were teaching in universities, that were writing in their languages, and that, were also part of their communities that didn't mind going off the reservation and continue to teach other people. And he has volumes of work. I think I heard him at a reading one time called his work the top 40. So I thought that was kind of funny. And then there are younger writers and newer writers, such as D.G. Ockpick. She's Inupiat from Alaska. Her poetry, Corpse Whale, is one that I always turn to because that particular collection is also highly experimental. But she does talk about, where she's from in Alaska. So that was really inspirational as far as work. And some of the newer writers, there's Tacey M. Etzedy. She's fairly new. Her book, Scald, I think is one that's inspirational to me as well. And she's Dene. And then also Esther G. Boleyn is also Dene. And she has a couple of books out that are very inspirational. I was very interested in Esther Boleyn's writing because her second book of cartography, she experiments with shape. There's a lot of shapes in her in that book that I found very curious to look at. Janice Gould, I've sat on panels with her. She used to teach in Colorado Springs, but she's passed away. So I was really sad to hear that she had, because I had read with her and sat on panels with her, and she was also very inspirational just to talk to as a poet and as a Native American. I think that she will be missed dearly. I also did a review of her last book, and I think you can find that online. But yes, her last book, Fold, I think. But it's a very beautiful book. Really love that book. And then, of course, Joy Harjun. She's done amazing work. She's sat as the American Poet Laureate for like 3 terms, which is unheard of. So she's always been an inspiration to me. When I graduated from IAIA after my graduate work, What do they call those when they print a poem on I forget what they're called. But one of her poems called Remember was given as a gift to all the graduates of that first cohort. And I saw her read in Albuquerque one time, and I got her to sign that for me and told her how inspirational she was. I remember my first time when I went to IAI, she came to one of our classes and spoke about poetry. And that was back in 1991. So, and I've been following her work since. She's very amazing. If you never heard her read, it's really nice to hear her read her work. Lately, Long Soldier has an important book that has come out. It's called Whereas, and it's one that I always keep around. You know, it's let's see, there it is. And it's one book that I always refer back to because it's so important. And as far as Native American, those are just a few. And I realized when I was thinking about that most of them are women that inspire me. And I was just thinking about that just now, is that many of the writers that I look back to are mostly women. For non-Indigenous writers, I owe a lot of gratitude to Arthur Z. He was the one that convinced me to change from being a 2D designer when I first entered college into being a writer. Yeah, and he taught me a lot about writing, and I've sort of just kind of owe a lot of my success in writing to him. I have a lot of his collections of writing on my shelf that I always refer back to. There's something that he's always teaching me every time I read his work. He taught at the Institute of American Indian Arts, but he's since retired, and I think he devotes a lot of his time to writing and speaking and devoting a lot of his time to other places where poetry is taught. A recent writer that I discovered is Ocean Vong. He's Vietnamese. Night Sky with Bullet Exit Wounds was one of the poetry books that he first released. And that book really inspired me. He was so eloquent in the way he wrote. I guess before that book was released, he released a chapbook from Sibling Rivalry, which sold out really quickly and now is out of print. I've been trying to look for that book because I was really interested in what he wrote in that book, but I've been unsuccessful in obtaining a copy. A Colorado poet, Dan Beachy Quick, is one that I follow a lot. His work deals a lot with the English language and how he is able to orchestrate language to work side by side. So he's one that I follow a lot. He teaches out in Fort Collins at the Northern Colorado University. James White, Michael Klein, a Mexican writer, poet by the name of Pura Lopez Colome. She has a book called Watchword, was another one that was a turning point in my writing. And of course, there's a lot of postmodern writers that I also follow that I teach in my classes as well. So my range of writers that influence me is huge. And I think that really helps me be very focused in terms of my intention in writing. But yes, a lot of my writing really started off really early in the 90s. Just because I did read a lot when I was a teenager, but at the time I was focused more on my paintings. But then I switched over to poetry, and I find painting and poetry kind of the same, because you are kind of using the same kinds of skills, but with poetry you're using words and descriptions, whereas in painting you're sort of using color and illustrations to to work with your expression, I guess. Um, Something that's really helped me develop my career, I guess. Like I said, I started off as a painter, and I still paint from time to time. I still work with illustration, but I spend most of my time working on writing, craft, trying to be more specific in the ways that I write, how I'm examining the ways that that I'm putting words together to mean something. And I think that that's always kind of really important if you're wanting to experiment with poetry. There's not really any limitations in terms of how I define poetry. In college, when I was studying a lot of poetry, a lot of them focus on the classics, which I think that there's a place for that. But I think that that's what turns a lot of people away from wanting to learn about poetry, is the classical ways that poets write. And that's where meter is introduced, where rhyming is introduced, and a lot of different forms of poems that are introduced. But I read a lot when I was going to school at Naropa. I read a lot of Charles Olson, who introduced to me the idea of projective verse, which is considered a free form of writing poetry, which means that there's not really a fixed format. You kind of make it up as you go. And for me, as a writing style, that's what I associated with the most, because it didn't really limit you to the way poems should sound or the way that we associate ourselves to writing. You're able to experiment with the format on the page, and you're able to justify a lot of those formats on the page. And my first book was really kind of a dedication to that, of how far I could really push the idea of poetry and what poetry should look like. And I think my first book was very, very experimental, because one of the things that I sort of thought in my head when I was writing this first book is that I didn't want to pay attention to the way poetry was traditionally written. I wanted to see the whole page as the landscape. So I don't know if I can see this, but I'm going to see if I can pull up my first book and maybe even share that. I just realized that I could probably share my screen.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the things is that a lot of people don't understand that there are different ways of doing poetry. Like you were saying, everybody hears the rhyming, but today I've heard, like you said, listing and other
Yes.
things, and it's interesting to hear what poetry, any kind of writing that has a specific I don't know, framework that you can walk into. And
Right. And that's one of the things that I thought about initially, is like, how can I look at poetry and just kind of move away from, the ways that, we're taught how to write poetry. And that's one of the things I try to encourage with my class, is that, because they're so used to the way we, like with the rhyming and the meter, and everything has to have like the iambic pentameter, and you have to count your syllables and, all of that. I mean, I know that that's all important as far as writing is concerned, but I think that the possibilities, especially working in free form, there's a lot of possibilities of how you can write your poem. Okay, I think I'm sharing my screen now.
yes,
No. No.
It says that you have
Okay.
but we don't see it yet. There it is.
There it is.
Okay. Yeah, I just pulled up my electronic copy of it, so I'm just going to move through it. So here's an example of the first part of my poem that I'm calling Collapse. As you can see, the title is up there, but how I'm working with the page is not just the way poems are justified to the left margin, right? And this poem started out as a concept of a structure, like I was thinking of it like a building. And then as the poem progresses, it feels more like falling. But one of the concepts that I took was from the idea of the Navajo weaving concept. And if you see this line here down at the very bottom, it just kind of goes through. The purpose for that line, and from what I understand about Navajo weaving, is that they purposely put in a mistake in the weaving so that any mistakes within that can find their way out and still exist as a creative work. And I know there's more detail to that, but that's really just the idea and the premise. So if you can see like the way that this poem is being orchestrated, it starts to build itself, and it more seems like falling. So here I'm working with my indigenous language and also with English language, and start to pair like a lot of concepts into this poem. And then it just keeps progressing in that way until finally you get to the very bottom, where I have the idea of our earth. And then in the Apache language is Nigostani, which is what we call Mother Earth. And I kind of leave it with that to kind of give it a much larger idea. And then we come to the silence of the collapse, where I leave it with the Apache language, which is really the translation of this is what was said a long time ago, which is Adajindi. And so that's really this poem and the way it's composed. When I was working with this particular poem and I was showing it to a lot of my advisors, they were really concerned with this poem because they said a lot of publishers, when they publish poems and they see a gap such as this in a poem, they most likely will not have that as part of the poem itself as a part of the publication. So I kind of got worried about that. And I was really hoping that they would print this poem as part of the collection. Here's another example of how I'm playing with format. This poem is called X. I originally had this poem published in the Tribal Journal. Maybe that's what it is. This is quite some time back, so I can't even remember but it won one of the first prizes for that publication. And here I start out with the phrase "a simple sound as," and as if you go through the poem, what I'm playing with is the sound of X. So I go through a lot of the different words and ideas and a lot of different concepts that pertain to indigenous identity, history, pertaining to this idea of X. And here I'm sort of leaning in the idea of X being that anomaly that we see in mathematics and also in identity, is that there's also this idea of the intersection of what X means, the unknown. So, but it's a very harsh sound. If you go through all of the different ideas and the way that X is represented in this particular poem, it's not the most pleasant sound. And I think in English grammar, it would be considered a fricative, one of the harsh sound, that's not pleasant. And here's that poem that I was talking about, the one for the 38 next plus 2. And as you can see, the construction here, there's the first part, and then there's a second part. But I try to do this dance with each line going back and forth. And the reason why I do that is because I wanted to dedicate it to the horse riders, but I wanted to also think of, when you do a trot on a horse, it does that. And I don't know how many people still ride horses or not, but I just remembered when I was a teenager and we would ride our horses I would just do this trot. It kind of has this rhythm to it. And as you see, I have them going up to with each step. Each like step one would be the name for one of the people who had been hung, and then step two would be the next. So it's just paying homage in terms of a list poem with each person's name being represented in the poem. So then again, this is a very long poem because there's 38 people that I was trying to honor. And this poem actually got me a Pushcart Prize nomination. And apparently it's a very high mention in the poetry world to be considered as a nominee. I didn't win the Pushcart Prize, but it was nominated by the Denver Quarterly, who's the one that sent it off to the Pushcart Prize people. So it's a very long poem, but it's one. Here is the one that got published in the newest anthology that was put out by Joy Harjo. When the light shone through, their voices came through, or something like that. It was a very long title. But this poem is what I'm calling the top of my chromosome poem, because there's two poems that look like this. And this one is the top of it. And it's called Des Son Two of Me, My Note to Selves, is where I'm really playing with the idea of gender, because in my language, son is woman and Husteen is man. But then as you go down toward the bottom of the poem, and I also interplay the masculine and feminine here, where the female side is being represented as the male, and the male side is being represented as the female. And as you can see, the poem, it digresses to itself. And down at the very bottom, you see that the Husteen, the male, and the her are put together, and the his son and his are also put together. And I end this poem with the word collide, because for me, again, like I was talking earlier, I'm just not accepting this idea of being placed into categories. And I don't like this idea of, having to be expected to be placed in these genres of character, whether it's male or female, because like I said, these constructs are made up and they really screw with people. If you allow yourselves to participate in this construct, there are expectations from each that you have to abide by, and I just simply don't want that, to be a part of my framework or my consciousness. I sort of see myself as just existing as I was meant to exist. And I think this poem is sort of representative of that. I'm just going to go scroll through to some other ways that I experiment with form. And one thing I had to sort of accept with this is just is a lot of these poems are long. I had to go back and rethink as to why my first book has a lot of long poems, and a lot of poems that are weighted with imagery. Here's another poem that I'm calling Severance, and this again is just a memory of just images of me growing up, and it's really about just my family, meaning my brother, my mother, and my father. And it's really a poem dedicated to them, really. And a lot of the poems that I'm looking at in this first collection have a lot of dedication to my immediate family, which is my father, my mother, and my brother. And my father passed away, and then my brother passed away, and then my mother, lastly, passed away. So for me, it's one of the poems that I've written that I call Severance, where I feel, I'm sort of on my own. I have other brothers and sisters, but they're half sisters. This is really in reference to my biological family. So one of the things I realized when I was writing this poem is that there's a reference here. I don't know if it was subconscious or unsubconscious or subconscious to the reference, but the phrase "my father gone, my brother gone, my mother." I was wondering if that was like an allusion to Jack Kerouac's On the Road, because there's a moment in his book where he does use that as a reference. And I reread that novel just recently, and I saw that connection. So I don't know if it was something subconscious or not. Again, here's the title, the poem title for the book, Genesis. This particular poem I kind of grapple with because originally this had a very specific structure to it. And the structure of this particular poem was to that of the whirling logs. And just to put it bluntly, the whirling logs is sort of the rendition of what the Nazis called a swastika, but I don't like to refer to it as that. But this particular poem was taking that idea and that concept and using it as a kind of metaphor and structure. Because there were formatting issues with the publisher and they didn't know how to really implement that structure, I broke it. So this is the final product of that particular poem. But if I were to reissue this book and I could find another publisher that could work with the original format, I definitely would try to get that back into the book because it was really a big part of the book or of this particular poem. And so I just kind of have to live with it. And here's a poem that it's kind of like a list poem, but I bullet pointed it because they were just really talking about characteristics. And this one was dedicated to one of my nephews who struggled in school. And this is really about his own struggle of his experience in school. So he was kind of an inspiration to me. I'm looking for, this poem is what I'm calling my X poem. Each poem is written like this, so that if you had the poem and you looked up at the light, you see the X. The second part of it is the ghost page. The second page is what I was playing with, which I thought was kind of interesting. And the only way you can see that is if you hold the page up to the light and you see the X. And you might see it conceptually here, if you're looking at the page. This one is what I'm calling Quadrants. And this one I dedicated for those who ever experienced separation. Here I'm playing with the idea of quadrants because they're aspects of who we are. And again, I'm playing with the idea of that cross section. Here we have the whirling logs that's sort of embedded in this negative space. But I have the words here to fill the other space. And there are 4 parts to this, and this was originally published in the Hawaiian Review back in 2016, I think. And there are four panels to this. And again, we're still playing with that idea of the cross section and the whirling log image with each of these poems. And again, here I'm playing with that X again. And then finally, we get to this moment where it becomes, sort of broken. And then I finally end up putting my fingerprint as the final panel of this particular poem. And as you can see, there's the question mark, the negative, and then the inequality, and then finally the X, the anomaly. And I also played a lot with redaction here. I took one of the entries of the treaty with the Apache in 1852, and I reprinted it in this book. But rather than giving it credence, my way of disavowing this action was to just redact it entirely. So, and this particular poem that I use as a visual kind of precedes this poem that was also inspired by this particular treaty. And I just changed the articles around. So artifact 1 was originally called artifact. Artifact 1 was originally called article, and I replaced it with artifact. And again, it's playing with this idea of form And I also put, my indigenous language in there just to kind of give it some credence and liberation. So here's the bottom part of the double helix, or my chromosome poem. And again, I start the poem off with my mother and my father. Shema is my mother, and Shita is my father. And then I end it with my brother, Shikis. So there's like this triangle or even a triad of form that I'm sort of playing with. And it's a dedication poem for my biological parents and my brother. So this book was a challenge because I wasn't really sure where I was going with it. At the back of the poem, I also have notes for a lot of the translations for the words that I'm using in the book. Yeah, for this particular publication, I really struggled with it because I wasn't really sure where I was going, with it. But I think it gave me some sense or some idea of what I wanted to do with my writing. But one thing I thought about in this book is that it gave me a lot of a lot of leeway to play with language, to play with form, and to maybe redefine what I thought poetry was all about. And it sort of took me back to the place where I began my artistry in terms of painting, because I saw my work as being part of the page as opposed to just the one-sided line you typically see writing with. And I can go on and on and on and on, but I don't know if there's anything specific that people really wanted to know about writing, because I know that there's a lot of different aspects to writing and what really makes writing work. A lot of my success really is just through word of mouth and building a network. I have a lot of writing friends that I lean upon, and they let me know where there's opportunities to publish work, or even to participate in conferences and whatnot. But yeah, I've really worked hard in the last 10, 15 years to build a strong network of friends that are heavily involved in the writing scene.
I know you've been part of our shows with me, and you're part of some of the shows that I had. And each time I reach out to you, you're willing to come on and talk about your poetry. But one of the things that I thought about was when you're talking about Mankato and Sand Creek, is that right now currently we have government institutions who are trying to get rid of anything that has to do, that shows that's not whitewashed over, and the negative parts, that the scars of this country, the bumps and bruises. They want it to be a perfect image. But there are things that happened in the past that they can't get rid of because it exists, and it's things that like you're doing with the poetry, bringing this to the forefront of what's gone on in the past and what is going on currently. We have people who cling to that whitewashed idea, and those ideas that we as Native people are the intruder. We are the ones who are standing in the way of modern society. And, I think that's poetry and things that come in writing become our voice. And that's part of what makes it powerful. they always say the pen is mightier than the sword. And sometimes you get to see it. And it becomes a powerful thing.
Yeah, I was speaking with a young individual who I guess did some research and found my name online. And he was very curious about one of the poems that is in my second book called Carrizo. And it's really about one of my uncles who returned from Vietnam. And my mom was telling me the story behind that because she said that when he came back from Vietnam, he was not the same person when he left. So he would always have these episodes where he would do flashbacks that he would think he's back in Vietnam. And so the poem is really about that. And it kind of when I wrote that poem, I didn't really think it was ever going to become a poem. But the story itself, what my mother told me was such a powerful story, because even that and how we think about war and how we think about people who serve, on reservations. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to come back to sometimes, and how people immerse themselves or try to immerse themselves back into a healthy way of living. And a lot of times that just doesn't get talked about, or that doesn't, get a lot of supports out there. But, it's really hard to sort of listen to something like that.
And I think one of the things we forget sometimes, and I mention it all the time, we send our children to war.
Yes.
And that's the thing. They are still growing, their minds are still developing. And you're coming from a place where no matter what hardships you have in life, 9 times out of 10, there's not somebody trying to shoot you.
Right. And the fact that we come from that as Indigenous people,
Yes.
Yeah, we stem from that manifest destiny,
Mm-hmm.
Many of us have been relocated. There are many that have been eradicated. And ironically enough, Apache people and Chiricahua Apache people were like the last to be rounded up and shipped off to reservations after being prisoners of war for a number of years.
Yeah, I used to bring to some of the classes when I would teach, Mildred Cleghorn,
Yes.
Louis Darrow. Here you have 2 women who talk about being prisoners of war for 27 years.
Yeah.
And talk about being with Geronimo.
Right.
And the kids are sitting there looking at you like, well, that happened in the Stone Age, how could that happen?
Yeah.
And to realize how close it is to now.
Yeah. And that we're all products of that, or we're the lineages, that's part of our lineage. And we're, we come from that history. I think it's taken me some time to realize that, even though I moved off the reservation, I got myself an education, my family still lives there. But if I really had to break that down to some question, everything about me comes from those experiences, from my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and the history that comes out of that. And I think that's what writing for me is all about, is memorializing the things that I can remember, and at least giving some honor to that.
Well, I really want to thank you for being here and being part of our group. So
yeah, well, thank you for asking me to do this. Sounds like you got some res dogs there.
Yeah, that's try to keep turning the mic off.
Yeah, it's nice to hear some res dogs. Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you for inviting me to do this. It was a great pleasure to talk about this idea of poetry, and to read my work and share that with people.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I really enjoyed that from beginning to end. I was at the edge of my wheelchair seat.
Yeah, I think the range of my writing is so vast. I mean, I don't like to just keep it to one idea. I really try to investigate a lot of different possibilities for writing.
One of the things that I appreciate about your sharing tonight, Chris, is the idea that I often have with photography is that if you don't know the rules, then you don't know that you're breaking any boxes. And your writing seems like the same approach. I liked how you laid out at the very beginning how you see a page like a landscape, and putting your voice by using words and using the whole page, you know. And I was like, okay, I get that. I can see that. I understand that. And it's still applying the way that we Native and Indigenous folks see the world in a picturesque type landscape. And we visualize it. And I like that approach that you had. Thank you for sharing. I never knew until you said it, until you put your own words to it, and excuse me, pardon me, and the tenor. And it's like, okay, I heard all of that. This is so cool.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think as far as like introducing these concepts to students, poetry allows you to do that. It allows you to visually see something and interact with it that way. I think half of the time, like I said, we sort of see something in a very narrow-minded way, but if we sort of open ourselves up a little bit, we can see the whole picture, like you said. And I think that's what I try to do and encourage students to do with their writing, is to not limit themselves, but also to trust their own method that they develop, or even the ways that they see their creativity. Because if they don't trust themselves, then they sort of limit themselves as well. So investigate, I try to encourage as much of that as I can.
Yes, it's very important to, to invest in the journey of discovering and mastering your voice, whatever that may be.
Right. So, but yeah, I really appreciate you allowing me to read my work and to share this with you all. And hopefully we talk some more about this.
You bet. We don't limit how many times you come on here. And,
Yeah. But yeah, I try to post a lot of stuff on social media regarding writing and what's going on, things I write about, things that are happening. And if I can, try to like point the directions to where I'm doing things, then I think try to help create some buzz about that as well.
Yeah, I would like to see you come back on again, and maybe even after the program's over tonight, you can hang around with us and just, we always stay afterwards and just kind of have a good time talking. Maybe you'll just start joining us for the heck of it.
Yeah, I can probably hang out for a little bit. I haven't eaten dinner, and I've been up since like 4:30 this morning. It's been a long day for me.
I just want to say, my name is Janet. I'm an artist and mostly painting, visual, but I used to do poetry, and the poem that you did with your talking about your family and everybody being gone and having a distant feeling with your mom and all, I like totally relate to that. And it's really funny because like I don't know, like, if I have any full brothers or sisters. I had one half brother in foster care with me, and we always seen each other as like full brother and sister. But the other thing I wanted to bring into light is I liked how you say, how you are so open-minded that you draw upon non-native and native artists. And with that being said, so the poem about your family really reminds me of John Lennon when he wrote that song about mother, his mom. And that song really kind of stood me up for many years before I got in touch with my native roots. My mother's from Akwesasne and my dad's from the other side of don't even know his nationality. I just tell people I'm Native and Irish. So my foster mother was Irish, but anyway, and I like the visual, like Sky just nailed it, how she described your work, but to see your work, it's like tying the visual motion into your written word. And I just think that's amazing, to open up a book and then see, the writing, kind of like it's combining the writing and with symbology, but yet you're still using words. And to reiterate on what Sky was saying, how Native people are very visual, and so kind of like, in a way, I feel there's a little bit of a connection with the way natives, like for instance, the Cree, they use symbols instead of like letters, like we do in English, And so I kind of got that feeling, like it just all came together, and you're just an incredible person and incredible artist, and I'm really just honored and humbled to be able to meet and see and listen to your work.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I was just thinking about that idea of language. I mean, like Apache language and Dene language, when I listen to that, a lot of their language is very descriptive, because they're really into like describing things as opposed to saying something is, It's like the word for hot. There's a very different ways that you can say hot and know what it means, but it can translate to a lot of different things. Or even this is for Ed, is like even the word for weed. We used to joke around growing up that the word for weed is but a lot of the younger kids now use that word for pot. So now when we listen to a lot of the younger people, when they use that word, we know they're not talking about the weeds out in the field. They're talking about, the smoke.
Yeah.
Don't you start anything. Go. Don't you start nothing now.
Yeah. So that's a good example of how like language works and how descriptive it can be to like represent other things. But yeah, so I for me, I mean, writing has always been just a huge part of my life, and I do love reading. There's not a moment that goes by when I'm not reading something. I just get so much by reading what others are writing. And if I have an opportunity to talk with people about writing, that's even a greater gift for me, because it's a moment where you can learn from somebody else about their perspectives on what they pour into writing, especially if they've been doing it for a number of years. I know when I first really started trusting myself to write, man, it was really hard to convince myself of that, because earlier on when I started submitting my work, I was just getting rejected left and right. And that's just the hard thing to accept at first, especially if you're new to it. But it took me a long time to get over that, and it made me feel better when I started building relationships with my writing friends, and started asking them for like tips, and using them as a guide to be better at what I do. But yeah, rejection is really hard. And now that I work for the offing, I'm sort of on the other side of that, where I do the rejecting, and that took some time to get used to, because I'm not very good at rejecting people, because I do know how I felt being rejected as far as my work, the amount of energy and the amount of effort that goes into, and the amount of love and care that goes into your work, and then somebody forces a judgment on you to say that wasn't good enough. Yeah, that took me a long time to get over, but I finally got over it and began to trust myself more, which is a hard thing to do, because you doubt yourself so often that how do you build yourself back up from that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah, but I think having friends and having friends that have gone through that process, it made myself feel better about the work that I was doing, because yeah, rejection is hard. But if you can talk to somebody about it, then it definitely makes you feel better, because you know that it's part of that process, and that you can't beat yourself up because of one place that won't take your work. Because it goes like that saying goes: if you get rejected 9 times, there's that one exception that happens. And because 9 places say no, then that one that says yes, it might be a better fit for why that work should exist in the world. But yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure if there's any right way to get over rejection, because it always feels bad when you get rejected. I recently got a rejection letter last week, because I wrote a story, and this was like fitting the horror genre. And I don't call myself a horror writer by any means, but I just thought I'd throw that out to the wind to see if it will work. I got my rejection letter back, and it said that the story was too passive. And I had to ask one of my writing friends what that meant, having your work be described as too passive. And I sent him the story, and he read it and enlightened me about what they probably meant by that. I guess it was a soft way of saying they didn't like the work, but that the characters within the story weren't active enough, that they were passive in the situation that I presented in the story.
Well,
that's
that's a native perspective for sure.
yeah. So it's just
Hey,
one of those.
we gotta get let's carry over this conversation into the after hour, because this is perfect
Okay.
segue to that. So, all you good folks, we thank you for joining us here on Facebook and on Zoom. This is the moment. This is the moment you all been waiting for. Are you ready? Here we
Good night,
go.
Facebook.
Good night,
night,
Facebook
Facebook.
land.
Right, Facebook.
No.